The air in the community hall hung thick and heavy, carrying a mixed scent of stale coffee, sweet vanilla from the cake table, and the faint chemical sharpness of floor cleaner. Long fluorescent lights, tubes on the ceiling hummed a constant, sleepy tune, casting a flat, almost shadowless light over everything. It was the kind of light that made everyone look a little tired, a little washed out. This was the annual fundraiser, an event that ran on good intentions and lukewarm donations. People milled about, their voices a low, constant murmur that rose and fell like a gentle tide, punctuated by the occasional clatter of a fork against a paper plate or a sudden burst of laughter from a circle of friends near the back wall. A young woman named Anya was trying to make a piece of crepe paper stick to the wall. She had been at this task for 10 minutes, carefully looping the cheap, flimsy streamer into a gentle arc and taping it up, only for it to uncurl and droop sadly a moment later. She sighed, a small, quiet sound that was lost in the room's chatter, and tried again. Anya was a volunteer, one of those reliable people who always showed up when help was needed. She was good at the background work, the unglamorous jobs that kept things running smoothly. She was the one who would stay late to stack chairs or wipe down tables without being asked. People knew her face, but not much more. They'd say a quick thanks, Anya, or a good job, but their eyes would already be scanning the room for someone else to talk to, someone more engaging. She wore a simple, comfortable sweater in a soft gray, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She didn't wear makeup or flashy jewelry. She had a way of making herself smaller, of taking up as little space as possible, both physically and in the conversations around her. She was an observer, a quiet collector of moments. As she fought with the streamer, she listened to the snippets of dialogue floating past her. A group of women nearby were excitedly discussing a trip one of them had taken to the coast, their words painting pictures of sunny beaches and fancy restaurants. Anya had never seen the ocean. Another group, mostly men, was debating the local sports team's chances this season, their voices loud and confident. Anya didn't follow sports. She felt a familiar, gentle pang of being on the outside looking in, like a child with her nose pressed against a bakery window. Watching everyone else enjoy the warm bread, her eyes drifted away from the party, away from the people and their easy conversations, and settled on the one thing in the room that seemed to share her feeling of being out of place. Tucked into a dusty corner, behind a table stacked with empty boxes, stood an old upright piano. It was a sad, neglected-looking thing. The wood was scuffed and scratched in 100 places. One of the black keys had a small triangular piece chipped off its edge. A fine layer of dust, almost too thin to see unless you looked closely, coated its top, as if it hadn't been played or even touched in years. It looked lonely, like a grand old lady who had been forgotten at a party, sitting silently while everyone else had fun. To anyone else, it was just a piece of old furniture. A relic from a time when community halls had more use for such things. But to Anya, it was a silent beacon. She felt a pull towards it that was both strong and frightening. In the quiet of her small apartment, a different world existed. There, tucked against a wall, was her own keyboard, a modern, sleek instrument with headphones that allowed her to disappear completely. For hours, she would lose herself in the music, her fingers moving across the keys with a confidence and grace that she never showed in the outside world. The music was her secret language, a place where she could be powerful, emotional, and free, all without saying a single word. It was her most treasured possession and her deepest secret. She remembered being a little girl, small enough that her feet couldn't reach the pedals of her grandmother's piano. Her grandmother would sit beside her, her wrinkled hands guiding Anya's tiny fingers, teaching her to feel the music, not just play the notes. "Every song tells a story, my dear," her grandmother used to say, her voice soft and warm. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. Music had been their bond, a shared world of beautiful melodies. But as she got older, things changed. She remembered the school talent show in the 8th grade. She had practiced for weeks, a piece that was complicated and beautiful. But when she got on stage, under the hot, bright lights with all those eyes on her, her mind had gone blank. Her fingers had felt like clumsy, foreign objects. She'd stumbled, missed a whole section, and the few quiet titters from the audience had felt like thunder. She had run off the stage, her face burning with shame. She had never played for an audience again. From that day on, her music became a private thing, a refuge. She played for herself, for the memory of her grandmother, for the sheer joy of it. But the fear of that stage, of those judging eyes, had never really left her. It was a wall she had built around her talent, thick and high. Anya finally gave up on the drooping streamer, letting it hang limply. She found a chair and moved it closer to the piano, pretending to be organizing some pamphlets on a nearby table, just so she could be nearer to it. She looked at the chipped key, the dusty surface. She could almost imagine the sounds it used to make, the songs it had sung for dances and meetings and holiday parties long ago. A small, daring part of her wondered what it would sound like now. If she were to just sit down and let her fingers find those familiar shapes, would the magic still be there, even on this old, tired instrument? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She quickly pushed it away, her heart beating a little faster. She was just Anya, the quiet volunteer, the girl who fixed streamers and wiped tables. The music was for her apartment, for her alone. Here, in this bright, noisy room, she was content to remain in the shadows, a silent observer guarding the beautiful secret that lived in her hands and her heart. The low hum of conversation in the hall began to falter, like a car running out of gas. The initial energy of the fundraiser, fueled by caffeine and polite greetings, was starting to wear thin. The woman in charge of the event, a stout, motherly figure named Mrs. D'Souza, was starting to wear thin, too. She moved through the crowd with a forced, bright smile that didn't quite reach her worried eyes. She checked her watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. The little gold-ticking hand a constant reminder that something was missing. The evening had a hole in it, a growing, awkward silence that was beginning to swallow the cheerful mood. The scheduled entertainment, a local husband and wife folk duo known for their inoffensive renditions of old pop songs, was now 45 minutes late. Mrs. D'Souza felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She had planned the evening with military precision, a welcome speech at 7, the first raffle drawing at 7:30, music to fill the gaps, and a final thank you at 9. The plan was falling apart. The gaps were no longer gaps. They were becoming canyons of awkwardness. People were finishing their cake and coffee, and with nothing to hold their attention. They were starting to gather their coats and whisper about leaving. Just then, her phone buzzed in her pocket with a frantic vibration. She ducked into the small kitchen area, away from prying eyes, and answered with a hushed, urgent hello. The conversation was short and one-sided. Mrs. D'Souza's face went from hopeful to pale, and flushed with a deep, frustrated red. No, I understand," she said, though her tone suggested she understood nothing and was furious about it. "Food poisoning. Both of you. Of course. Get some rest. Don't worry about us." She hung up the phone and leaned against the counter, pressing her palms into her eyes. The duo wasn't just late. They weren't coming at all. The evening was officially a disaster. Taking a deep breath, she pasted the bright smile back on her face and marched back into the main hall. She needed a plan B, but there was no plan B. She had put all her faith in a couple with a guitar and a harmonica. Now, she had nothing but a raffle drum and a rapidly emptying room. Her eyes scanned the crowd desperately, looking for... What? A magician? A comedian? A juggler? She saw only familiar, ordinary faces. The baker from the local shop, the man who ran the hardware store, parents from the school her children had attended years ago. There was no hidden talent here, no secret superstar, just people hoping to support a good cause and have a pleasant evening out. Her gaze swept past the cake table, past the groups of people now standing in shrinking circles, and landed in the dusty corner of the room. It settled on the old piano, and then on the young woman standing near it. Anya, Mrs. D'Souza, remembered her. She was always one of the first to arrive for volunteer events, and one of the last to leave. She was quiet, almost invisible, but she was reliable. And then, a faint memory sparked in her mind. She couldn't recall who had told her, maybe her own daughter years ago. But she had a vague recollection that this quiet girl played a little. It was a long shot, a desperate, flimsy thread of hope. But it was the only one she had. With a renewed, frantic purpose, Mrs. D'Souza navigated through the thinning crowd. Anya was just standing there, looking a little lost, her hands tucked into the pockets of her gray sweater. She seemed to be watching the piano more than the people.
"Anya, dear,"
Mrs. D'Souza said, her voice a little too bright, a little too loud. She put a hand on Anya's arm, her touch light but urgent. Anya flinched slightly, pulled from her thoughts. "Oh, hello, Mrs. D'Souza. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine. Just fine." Mrs. D'Souza led, her smile unwavering. "But I do find myself in a bit of a pickle. Our entertainment for the evening has had a sudden emergency. They won't be able to make it." She paused, looking Anya up and down, not with curiosity, but with the calculating eye of a problem solver. "Now, I heard a rumor once. A little birdie told me that you played the piano. Is that right?" The question hit Anya like a splash of cold water. Her heart immediately started to beat faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. The piano? Her secret. The wall she had so carefully built around it felt like it was being shaken. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to deny it, to shake her head and say, "No, not me. You must be thinking of someone else." The lie wouldn't come out. Seeing her hesitation, Mrs. D'Souza rushed on, her words tumbling over each other. "I know this is a huge, huge favor to ask, and please feel free to say no. I completely understand. But we have this awful silence, and people are starting to leave, and we haven't even done the main raffle yet." She gestured vaguely towards the silent instrument in the corner. "Could you possibly just play something? Anything simple, honestly. Just a little tune to fill the air. Nothing fancy. Just some background noise, you know? No one will really be listening. We just need something." The request was both a lifeline and a threat. Just a simple tune. Background noise. No one will really be listening. The words were meant to be reassuring, to take the pressure off, but to Anya, they were a perfect description of her greatest fear. To be unnoticed, to have her art, her soul, dismissed as mere noise. The memory of the school talent show flashed in her mind, the hot lights, snickering, the crushing weight of all those eyes expecting her to fail. Her palms began to sweat, and she felt a familiar tremor in her hands. "Oh, I don't think I could," Anya finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "I'm not very good." "Not really. Nonsense," Mrs. D'Souza insisted, her grip on Anya's arm tightening just a little. "Anyone who can play at all is better than this dreadful silence. Please, Anya, it would be such a help. Just for a little while, until we can get the next part of the raffle going." Her eyes were pleading, desperate. She looked like a woman about to lose a battle. Anya was the only soldier left on the field. Anya looked from Mrs. D'Souza's frantic face to the old piano in the corner. It seemed to be calling to her, a dusty, forgotten friend. She thought of the quiet joy it gave her in her apartment, the way the music could transport her away from her shyness and her fears. But this wasn't her apartment. This was a room full of people, a room full of potential judgment. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to make an excuse and slip out the back door. But then she saw the genuine desperation in the older woman's eyes. It wasn't about the music for her. It was about saving her event. It was about the community center, the cause they were all there to support. A tiny, reluctant sense of duty began to push back against the mountain of her fear. She thought of her grandmother, who always told her that music was a gift meant to be shared. Her grandmother had never seen her fail on that stage. She had only seen the love of the music in her granddaughter's eyes, taking a shaky breath that felt more like a surrender than a decision. Anya gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay," she breathed out, the word barely a whisper. I'll try." A wave of relief washed over Mrs. D'Souza's face. "Oh, thank you, dear. You're a lifesaver." She gave Anya's arm a final, grateful pat and bustled away to announce the special musical treat they were about to have. Leaving Anya standing alone, frozen to the spot, the short walk to the corner felt like the longest journey of her life. Every step was heavy, as if she were walking through mud. She could feel a few curious eyes on her. people wondering who this quiet volunteer was and why she was heading towards the piano. The room seemed to grow quieter as she moved, the low hum of conversation fading as she pulled out the creaky wooden bench. The sound of the wood scraping against the linoleum floor was loud, sharp, and final. She sat down, the worn fabric of the bench cool beneath her. She lifted her hands, and for a moment they hovered over the keys, trembling. She looked at the chipped black key, the dusty surface, and felt a strange mix of terror and a tiny flickering spark of something else. A spark of possibility. She was here. There was no turning back. The worn wooden bench felt cold and hard beneath her. Anya sat perfectly still, her hands hovering over the yellowed ivory keys, her fingers trembling so slightly she hoped no one could see. The air in the room seemed to press down on her, thick with the weight of 100 casual conversations. She could hear the clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug, a burst of laughter from a table by the door, the low murmur of voices that blended together into a formless, indifferent hum. These sounds were her enemies. They were the sound of her own insignificance. What was she thinking? She couldn't do this. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs, desperate to escape. She wanted to stand up, to mumble an apology, and to disappear into the night and never come back. But her feet felt rooted to the floor. Mrs. D'Souza's pleading eyes flashed in her mind. The thought of letting her down, of causing the event to fail, was a different kind of weight, a heavy, disappointing one. Taking a deep, shaky breath that did little to calm her nerves, she let her fingers settle on the keys. They felt foreign and clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else. The plastic of the chipped black key was cool and smooth against her fingertip. She closed her eyes for just a second, trying to block out the room, trying to find that quiet place inside herself where the music lived. She started to play. It was a simple tune, the one her grandmother had taught her first. A children's song, a melody so basic and familiar that almost anyone would know it. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The notes came out hesitantly at first, a little plunky and uneven on the old untuned piano. A couple of notes sounded slightly sour, but she pushed through. This was what they asked for. A simple tune. Background noise. And that's exactly what it was. As she played, she could hear that the conversations in the room didn't stop. No one turned to look. The hum of the crowd continued, a constant flowing river of sound that her little melody was completely lost in. She was just as invisible as she had always been, only now she was making quiet, plunking noises in the corner. A fresh wave of shame washed over her. This was a mistake. She finished the melody once through, her fingers feeling stiff and awkward. She should stop now. She had done what was asked. But as her hands lingered on the keys, something strange happened. The familiar act of playing, the simple muscle memory of her fingers finding the notes, began to soothe the frantic bird in her chest. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the music was a warm blanket being slowly draped over it. She started the melody again, this time a little more confidently. She added a simple harmony in the left hand, a basic set of chords that gave the tune a little more body as she played the second verse. Her mind began to drift away from the room. The voices, the clinking cups, the laughter, it all started to fade into a distant blur. Her world shrank to the space between her hands and the 88 keys in front of her. She was no longer in a brightly lit community hall. She was back in her grandmother's living room, sun streaming through the window, dust motes dancing in the light like tiny golden notes. She could almost smell the faint scent of her grandmother's lavender perfume. The music was no longer a task. It was a memory. It was a conversation with a ghost. And then, without her even consciously deciding to do it, the music began to change. The simple melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star was still there, but it was starting to transform. It became a seed, a single idea from which something new and complex began to grow. Her right hand started to wander, weaving intricate patterns around the original tune. The notes were no longer hesitant. They were flowing, one into the next, like a stream finding its path downhill. The music was telling a story now. It started with the simple innocence of the children's song, but then it added a layer of something else, a touch of melancholy, a sense of longing. A hush began to fall over the room. It didn't happen all at once. It started with one person, a man who had been talking loudly about his new car, who stopped mid-sentence as his ears caught the change in the music. He turned his head towards the corner. The person he was talking to followed his gaze. The silence spread from their table like a ripple in a pond. Another conversation trailed off, then another. People who had been getting ready to leave found themselves standing still, their coats in their hands, their attention drawn to the soft, powerful sound coming from the forgotten piano. Anya didn't notice. She was lost. The wall she had built around her talent, the one made of fear and shame, was crumbling. The music was pouring through the cracks, a force of nature that could no longer be contained. Her posture changed. Her back straightened. Her shoulders, which had been hunched in self-protection, relaxed. Her touch on the keys became lighter, more expressive. She was no longer just pressing notes. She was caressing them into life. The old piano, which had sounded so tired and plunky at first, seemed to be waking up under her hands. Its slight imperfections, the unique resonance of its old wood and strings, gave the music a character, a warmth that a perfect, modern instrument might not have had. The melody grew more complex, more passionate. It spoke of quiet loneliness, of watching the world from a distance. It captured the feeling of being an observer, of having a rich inner world that no one else could see. Then the mood shifted again. A new theme emerged, built on top of the first. It was hopeful, full of a quiet strength and a growing sense of confidence. It was the sound of a door creaking open, of a person stepping out of the shadows and into the light. The music swelled, filling every corner of the hall. It was no longer background noise. It was the main event. It was the only thing that mattered. The entire room was captivated. 100 people stood in silence, their faces turned towards the young woman at the piano. The woman who had been arranging streamers, the quiet volunteer who no one really knew, was holding them all spellbound. They weren't just hearing music. They were feeling an emotion, a story so powerful and so real that it resonated with their own hidden hopes and fears. A young woman in the back had tears streaming down her face without knowing why. An old man, his arms crossed over his chest, found himself leaning forward, a look of utter awe on his face. Mrs. D'Souza stood near the entrance, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had asked for a simple tune to fill a silence. She had been given a masterpiece that had created a new, more profound silence of its own. The music reached its peak, a cascade of beautiful, intricate notes that seemed to hang in the air like glittering stars, and then, with one final, resonant chord, it stopped. The final chord didn't just end, it dissolved. The sound, which had filled every corner of the hall with such life and emotion, seemed to melt into the air, leaving behind a space that felt both empty and profoundly full. For a long moment, the world was held in that silence. It wasn't an awkward or uncomfortable silence. It was a heavy, reverent hush, the kind that follows a deeply shared experience. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling continued their low, steady hum, a sound that had been annoying before but now seemed like the only appropriate noise. A quiet, respectful bow to the masterpiece that had just been created. No one moved. No one spoke. 100 people stood as if frozen, their eyes fixed on the young woman at the piano. Their faces a canvas of reflected emotion, wonder, and a touch of melancholy the music had left behind. Anya's fingers rested on the keys. The last vibration of the strings, a faint tremor she could feel through her fingertips. She was still lost in the world the music had built, her eyes half closed. The silence felt like a natural extension of the final note, a peaceful resolution. She wasn't aware of the audience, of the stares, of the way the entire atmosphere of the room had shifted. She was just floating in the quiet aftermath, her heart no longer beating with fear but with a deep, resonant calm. The wall she had lived behind for so many years had not just crumbled. It had been completely vaporized, leaving her feeling strangely naked and exposed, yet also incredibly light. Slowly, like a diver rising from the deep ocean, she began to become aware of her surroundings again. The first thing she noticed was the weight of the silence. It was different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with expectation. She became conscious of the stillness of the bodies around her. She lifted her head and her eyes focused on the room. She saw them. All of them. Looking at her, the familiar wave of panic started to rise in her throat. The old instinct to flee, to hide. Her hands began to tremble on the keys. And then a single sound broke the spell. It was the sound of one person clapping. It wasn't loud or rushed. It was a slow, deliberate clap coming from an old man standing near the back. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated appreciation. The sound cut through Anya's rising panic like a sharp, clear knife. Her head snapped in the direction of the sound, her eyes wide. That one clap was followed by another, then a few more, scattered throughout the room. People seemed to wake from a trance. The sound grew, slowly at first, then gathering momentum until it was no longer just clapping. It was a wave. It was a storm. The entire room erupted in a roar of applause that was so loud and so sudden, it felt like a physical force. It was not the polite, obligatory clapping after a school recital. This was something else entirely. It was thunderous, emotional, and overwhelming. People were not just clapping. Some were whistling. Others were stamping their feet. The young woman in the back was now openly wiping tears from her cheeks. A huge smile on her face. Anya sat frozen on the bench, her hands gripping the edges of the piano as if to keep from being swept away by the sound. This was the opposite of everything she had ever feared. There were no snickers, no whispers of ridicule. There was only this deafening, beautiful, terrifying wave of approval. A joy so pure and powerful it brought tears to her own eyes. But with the joy came a dizzying sense of exposure. Her secret, her most private world, was no longer a secret. She had laid it bare for everyone to see, and instead of turning away, they had embraced it. Embraced her. The feeling was so intense, so foreign, she didn't know how to process it. She felt a smile tug at her lips, but it felt shaky, uncertain. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she knew she had to do something. She couldn't just sit there forever. With legs that felt weak and unsteady, she pushed herself up from the bench. She turned to face the room, her movements clumsy. She didn't know what to do with her hands. She gave a small, awkward half-wave, a gesture that felt utterly inadequate. This only seemed to make the crowd cheer louder as the applause began to subside into a more gentle, rhythmic clapping. People started to move. A path opened through the crowd as people made their way towards her. Anya's first instinct was to step back, to hide behind the piano, but there was nowhere to go. The first person to reach her was the baker from the local shop, a woman who had never said more than a simple hello to her in the past. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard, the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. Truly beautiful. Where did you learn to play like that? Before Anya could even form a response, another person stepped forward. You told a story with that music. I don't know how, but you did. I felt like you were talking right to my heart. More people surrounded her, a sea of smiling, appreciative faces. They weren't just being polite. Their eyes were shining with a genuine light. They asked her questions, not about her volunteer work or her quiet life, but about her music, about her inspiration, about how she could create such magic with an old, forgotten piano. Anya found herself answering in a quiet, halting voice, still in a state of shock. She had never talked about her music to anyone outside of her grandmother. The words felt strange and new on her tongue. Then she saw Mrs. D'Souza pushing her way through the crowd. The organizer's face was a picture of utter disbelief. When she reached Anya, she didn't say anything at first. She just grabbed both of Anya's hands in her own and held them tightly. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. D'Souza finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "I asked you for a simple tune. I asked for background noise. And you gave us that." She shook her head as if trying to clear it. "I am so sorry I underestimated you. I am so grateful. You didn't just save my event tonight. You gave everyone here a gift they will never forget." The sincerity in the older woman's eyes, the warmth of her hands, finally broke through the last of Anya's shock. The reality of what had happened began to sink in. She had done it. She had faced her fear, and instead of being destroyed by it, she had been lifted up. The quiet observer, the invisible volunteer, was now the center of attention. Not because she was being scrutinized, but because she was being celebrated. The room no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a sanctuary. The people were not a threat. They were an audience who had truly listened. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth and admiration of the crowd, Anya felt a new feeling begin to blossom in her chest. A feeling that was stronger and more powerful than any fear she had ever known. It was the feeling of being seen and being accepted for exactly who she was. The ride home was silent in a way the community hall had never been. The friend who had given her a lift, a woman who usually chattered nonstop, seemed to sense that Anya needed the quiet. The streetlights blurred past the car windows, painting streaks of orange and white on the dark canvas of the night. Anya sat with her hands folded in her lap, not speaking, barely moving. Inside her, there was a storm of feelings, but on the surface, she was a calm, still lake. The roar of the applause still echoed in her ears, not as a sound, but as a vibration that seemed to have settled deep in her bones. It was a warmth that fought against the cool night, air seeping through the car window. When she got back to her small apartment, the first thing she did was walk to her keyboard. It sat against the wall, sleek and black, a stark contrast to the old, battered piano at the hall. She ran a finger over its smooth, plastic keys, keys that had never felt the terror of 100 eyes on them. This was her safe place, her sanctuary. But tonight, it felt different. It felt smaller. She thought of the old upright, with its chipped key and dusty top, and how it had woken up under her hands, how it had sung a story she didn't even know she had in her. She realized then that the music wasn't in the instrument. It wasn't in the safety of her headphones. It was in her. It had always been in her. The performance hadn't created the music. It had simply unlocked the door and let it out. The next day, the world felt like a new place. Simple errands, like going to the local market for a loaf of bread, became strange and new experiences. As she stood in line, the baker, a man who had served her for years without ever really seeing her, looked up from the cash register, and a wide, knowing smile spread across his face. "Well, look who it is," he said, his voice warm and friendly. "Heard you put on quite a show last night. They're saying you're the talk of the town." Anya felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but it wasn't a blush of shame. It was a blush of surprised pleasure. She mumbled a quiet thank you, paid for her bread, and left, feeling the eyes of a few other customers on her. They weren't judging eyes. They were curious, appreciative eyes. The invisible girl had become visible. Over the next few days, the story of her performance seemed to take on a life of its own. It was passed from person to person, growing a little with each telling. It wasn't just that a girl had played the piano well. It was that a quiet, unassuming volunteer had transformed a dull evening into something magical. It was a modern-day fairy tale, and she was the unlikely heroine. Then, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She answered it hesitantly. "Hello? Is this Anya?" A man's voice asked. "Yes, this is her." "Hi, my name is David. I own the little cafe on Maple Street, the Daily Grind. I was at the fundraiser on Saturday night." Anya's heart gave a little skip. "Oh, hello. Listen," he said, his voice direct and kind. "I'll be honest with you. I'm not a big music guy. I don't know a sonata from a sandwich. But what you did, I've never heard anything like it. My place is usually pretty quiet on Saturday afternoons. People come in, read their books, drink their coffee. I was wondering if you might be interested in playing for us. Just for a couple of hours. Nothing fancy. Just some background music like you do so well." He chuckled gently. "Of course, I'm hoping the background music is a little more like what you did Saturday night. What do you say? No pressure. Just think about it." He hung up, and Anya stood in the middle of her living room, the phone still in her hand. A gig. He was offering her a real gig. The old fear, the familiar ghost of the 8th grade talent show, tried to whisper in her ear, "You can't do it. You'll mess up." people will be watching. But this time, the voice was faint, distant. It was like an echo from another life. The memory of the thunderous applause, the feeling of Mrs. D'Souza as warm hands in hers, the look of pure awe on the baker's face. These things were so much louder. She thought of her grandmother and how she had always said the music was a gift to be shared. Maybe, she thought, it was finally time to start unwrapping it. She called David back the next day and said yes. Her first Saturday at the cafe was nerve-wracking. But it was a different kind of nerve-wracking. It wasn't the cold terror of the fundraiser. It was a fluttery, excited energy. The cafe was cozy, filled with the rich smell of coffee and the sweet scent of cinnamon. David had set up a small keyboard for her near the window. People were scattered around the room, some reading, some talking in low voices. No one was staring at her. She was just part of the scenery. She took a deep breath and began to play. She didn't try to recreate the masterpiece from the fundraiser. That was a moment in time, a perfect storm of emotion and circumstance. Instead, she played something softer, more gentle. She wove in melodies she had been practicing for years in her apartment, little snippets of songs she had composed herself. The music flowed out of her, not like a flood, but like a quiet, steady stream. It filled the spaces between the clinking of cups and the soft murmurs of conversation. A woman reading a book looked up and smiled. A man working on his laptop started to tap his foot to the rhythm without realizing it. It wasn't a performance that demanded attention. It was one that earned it, gently and naturally. This became her new routine. Every Saturday afternoon she would play at the Daily Grind. It gave her a small, steady income, but more importantly, it gave her a stage. A place where she could practice being the new Anya. She was still a quiet person, but she was no longer invisible. She would pack up her keyboard, and people would smile at her and say, "See you next week," and it felt good. It felt right. A few weeks later, she had to go to the community hall for a volunteer meeting. As she walked down the familiar hallway, she felt a sense of nostalgia. She peeked into the main room. It was empty and quiet, the chairs stacked against the walls. And there in the corner was the old, upright piano. She walked over to it. It looked different. The dust was gone. The wood had been polished. It looked cared for, respected. Someone had placed a simple vase with a single flower on top of it. She smiled and ran her finger over the familiar, chipped black key. The piano was no longer a symbol of her fear and neglect. It was a monument to the night she had set herself free. The masterpiece she had delivered that evening wasn't just the music that had filled the room. The real masterpiece was the new melody that was now playing in her own life. Quiet, confident, and beautiful song of a girl who finally found her voice and learned that the most beautiful music is the one you share with the world.